As we move on to chapter 19, please make sure that you are prepared to highlight any quotes within this chapter that you feel are significant and practice doing some close level, word level analysis in terms of using quotes to support your ideas. So we move on to chapter 19, and of course Van Helsing, Seward, Quincy, Jonathan Harker and Arthur have gone to Carfax. They find 21 boxes have been removed from the chapel, and Mina of course has a disturbing dream. Okay, start off in chapter 19 with Jonathan Harker's journal dated the 1st of October, 5 a.m. All right, and the men make their way to Carfax, and Jonathan feels happy because he believes Mina is safe back at the house. All right, Quincy feels really sorry for poor Rainfield, and of course finally the penny starts to drop and Seward starts to realize that Rainfield and Dracula are in fact connected. As they head out to Carfax, Van Helsing gives each man a number of items. So they're given a crucifix, some garlic blossoms, and a portion of a sacred wafer, which of course are for protection. Jonathan obviously knows the place very well because he is the one who was instructed in purchasing Carfax, and of course he looked at the plans, studied the plans in great detail, and is able to lead the men straight to the chapel. As they get inside the chapel, Jonathan describes the smell that they encounter, and he says it was composed of all the ills of mortality and with a pungent, acrid smell of blood, but it seemed as though corruption had become itself corrupt. For it sickens me to think of it. Every breath exhaled by that monster seemed to have clung to the place and intensified its loathsomeness. All right, so just to remind you about the benefits and significance and importance of your close textual analysis, if you are looking at a quote like this, you would focus on the aspect of the quote thing, the phrase ills of mortality. You would look at the verb clung, and you would talk about the adjectival clause intensified its loathsomeness. Again, we're talking about the idea ills being all the sin and evil, the actions of the living, and that's overwhelming the sins of everybody alive. Okay, we'd be looking at the idea that it clung. Clung is this verb, means hanging on. It's almost desperate. It just refuses to let go. And the idea of intensifying in its loathsomeness, the fact that it's growing, becoming darker, stronger in loathsomeness. And to loathe someone is worse than hatred. It's that awful. It's the sheer vileness, the sheer hatred. So you'd be exploring about how the chapel smells, this pungent, acrid smell that just clings. It's this idea that all the evil that Dracula is and that he encompasses and that he represents is so bad that it's visceral, it's tangible, you can taste it, and it's hanging in the air. Even though he's no longer there, it's still clinging to the air. That is how strong and how potent it is. So those are the kind of things, that's the kind of depth that we're expecting you to go into. So the gentlemen obviously are in the chapel, they check the boxes, and oh my goodness, they find 21 are missing. All right, and something moves in the shadows. Again, let me remind you, what do shadows represent? Shadows tend to represent the existence of lurking evil. So we already are given the implication without Stoker having to say it, because shadows have connotations of evil and lack of light and knowledge. So we know that they are unaware of what is hiding in the darkness. What happens to be hiding in the darkness is thousands of rats which suddenly appear, and all save Lord Godalming, who was seemingly prepared for such emergency, they're all absolutely shocked by this. And of course, Godalming or Arthur managed to call dogs to deal with these rats so the men can continue with their search. Remember, in the previous chapter, Van Helsing talks about how Dracula can transform into a creature such as a rat. And again, just remember that rats tend to symbolize decay, blight, death, disease, and famine. So it's the irony in that, of course, Dracula represents the same, hence why he chooses to transform into a rat. You certainly don't see him transforming into a bunny or a unicorn or a guinea pig. Let's be fair about that. Right, so once they've discovered 21 boxes are missing, they get home and they hear noises from Renfield's cell. Jonathan finds Mina asleep, but she's very, very pale. Okay, so remember, again, we're still in his journal, and when he wakes Mina later during the day, she looked at me, so the me being Jonathan, with a sort of blank terror as one looks who's been waked out of a bad dream. Now, we, the reader, are hearing major alarm bells here, because it's the idea that she has been completely frightened within her dreams, and we are reminded immediately of Lucy and the parallels between Lucy and Mina. And when were Lucy's dreams completely disturbed, of course, was when Dracula was infiltrating them. So we, the reader, are hearing this clang, 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 and we're thinking, for goodness sake, Seward, for goodness sake, Jonathan, for goodness sake, Quincy, Arthur, Van Helsing, realize what's going on here. Seward's diary, and we're still on the 1st of October, and Van Helsing awakens Seward and asks if he would take him, Van Helsing, to go and see Renfield. Renfield is excuse me, very rude to Van Helsing, and again we need to think about why, and we need to be reminded of the fact, and Van Helsing poses a threat to Dracula. He was polite, Renfield was polite to Mina, because of course Dracula sees Mina as his next victim. In this case, of course, Van Helsing is a danger and to Dracula, and Renfield's connection to Dracula is such that he will manifest Dracula's opinions, and hence why he's rude to Van Helsing. Right, after the visit, Van Helsing and Seward discuss memory and the relationship with thought. And again, this philosophical conversation is twofold. Firstly, it is a reminder to us, the reader, that of course these stories are all based on character memory and the idea that they are fragmented, but also just a reminder to us, the reader, that they are very intelligent men, and that in fact Stoker himself is up to date with all the latest theories and philosophical ideas, and hence why he's popping them into his novel. This was a very contemporary novel at the time. While Van Helsing and Seward have this conversation, Quincy and Arthur go in search of the boxes of earth. Mina clearly begins her journal, and that is also dated the 1st of October. Quite a lot is happening on the 30th of September and the 1st of October. And Mina has mixed feelings about the fact that she's been excluded from the action because of the danger that is perceived. She's keeping this diary for her husband. And she's writing about how all their best intentions to shield her from stress, from anxiety, from the terror, have actually achieved the opposite. They wanted her to be have peace and be safe, whereas she's actually now overwhelmed by anxiety, stress, and having terrible dreams. So again, this chapter is full of irony, okay, because despite stating in previous chapters that no one should be keeping secrets from one another, Mina's not telling anyone about her dreams. She has fallen asleep and she recalls a strange white mist, and Renfield struggles, but she doesn't share this. She does not talk about the strange livid white face that goes over her. Okay, she actually realizes the similarity between her dream and Jonathan's account of the vampire attack when he was in Castle Dracula, but she doesn't question the reality of her dream. And we know that, of course, the white mist and the livid face are not a dream. Okay, so Mina recognizes a similarity between her dream and her husband's accounts. So this chapter, again, they're keeping secrets from one another. Mina doesn't tell anyone about her dreams, and we need to think about why. Why has she chosen not to do this? Maybe because she is excluded from the manly, dangerous activities. But to me, it's a little bit odd that despite the fact that she makes this connection between, or she says that her dreams remind her of reading Jonathan's journal, she doesn't seem to make the connection that between her dream and Lucy's downfall and Dracula. So we, the reader, are beginning to question, has Dracula managed to infiltrate her mind? I also find it odd that no one seems to notice how suddenly very pale Mina is, how very tired. She's suddenly got these bags under her eyes, and she's kind of reminiscent. She's almost a mirror image of what Lucy looked like towards the end of her life. Yet nobody else seems to be noticing this, and it is a little bit disturbing that they don't seem to have learned from their mistakes. Again, a narrative construct to make us, the reader, frustrated, to develop tension, but also kind of just a very insightful look at human nature, I reckon. So again, the idea of this livid white face bending over me out of the mist is very reminiscent of the dream, or when she follows Lucy out, when Lucy goes sleepwalking, and she watches that figure loom over Lucy on the bench in the graveyard. We then move on to the 2nd of October, and she talks about how it's still Mina's diary, and she talks about how she slept but did not dream. I think the greatest irony in this chapter and in this section itself is that by excluding Mina from the dangers, or what they perceive to be excluding her from the dangers, they actually put her in more danger, because they don't take her with them because they're scared something will happen, but therefore they leave her alone, and she is isolated and therefore more vulnerable. In order to sleep, she gets a sleeping draught from Seaward, and the irony of this, of course, is it makes her even more, it makes her easier prey for Dracula. So she, by being excluded, is being put at in graver danger than she would have been had she joined the men. Again, I think that the other thing that we need to remember is that the men's decision not to let Renfield go is also crucial. And it's also a mistake, because Dracula, we know, uses other individuals, other forms, other shapes to gain access to his prey. And of course, he's going to use Renfield to gain access to Mina and the house. I think it's also quite interesting that the chapter ends on an ominous note, because Mina says, I may have been foolish in thus depriving myself of the power of waking. So we have it ending on Mina's anxious and actually prophetic realization that by taking something to help her sleep, she might not be able to help herself wake up if she needs to. And as we know, of course, Dracula infiltrates via the dream. So I think we need to just remind ourselves that the later portions of this chapter present us with the clue, and I'm going to say here, however slight, maybe not so slight, that Mina is about to become Dracula's next victim. Okay. Why has she been chosen? Well, it's certainly not accidental. She is the wife of Jonathan Harker, and remember, of course, Dracula encountered Jonathan in Transylvania, and she's also the best friend of Dracula's last victim, and that was Lucy. We are made aware of Dracula's infiltration, of his visiting her in the night via dreams, through her writing. So she writes in a very impressionistic way. She records things in her journal which she doesn't really understand or associate with vampirism. She's just writing down what has happened. She's not making the link. She's not making the connections. And of course, this is dramatic irony because we, the reader, are fully aware of what is transpiring, and we are yelling at everybody at this point saying, wake up, can you not realize what is happening? Of course, I think there's also curious ambiguity in this chapter because we are reminded that, of course, vampires cannot enter a domicile without permission, or a homestead without permission. Yet Dracula manages to get access to Mina's room. Is it that has she left the window open? Has she some way invited him in? Maybe the implication is that he has gained access through the actions of Mina herself, rather than in any other way. And again, we are reminded that if there was complete awareness, perhaps Mina and the men would have acted differently.